My Mother, The Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fatuma Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdisamed Mohammed, Ayaya we call her. That's the Somali word for grandmother. And her great-grandkids call her Ayaya too, and that's their way of saying great-grandmother. To make sure what happened that time when my mother just got up and left the house without us knowing, I set up a monitored alarm system in the house. So I paid for the system, a company to come in and install alarm system in the house, and I paid monthly fee for them to monitor the alarm system. So I thought if this helped me sleep well at night, then it was worth the money I spent. But after a couple nights of having that monitored alarm system, my mother started to open the patio sliding door, tripping the alarm every hour on the hour. And to top that problem off, the plan was the alarm company will call us every time they get a notice of an alarm. And alarm system was connected to the landline. They would call that number. So, and at the time we had, I don't know if you remember having them, a lot of people had them at the time. We had these phones where they were cordless, handheld sets. We had 3 of them that connected to the same landline, and you can take the phone and you would not be restricted by a cord, and you can be anywhere in the house. And when you're done with the ideas, you'll put it back on the cradle for it to be charged. So we had 3 of those, and there is 6 of us in the house. So at any given time, none of the 3 phones are on the cradle. And some of them are dead because they've been off the cradle for hours. And even if the phone had still charged to it, it's ringing, you can hear it, but you don't know where it is. And if the alarm company calls and we don't answer right away, they hang up and they call the emergency personnel. And they call all 3 of them. They call the police, the ambulance, and fire department. And all of them, before we knew it, within a minute or 2, all 3 were descending on us. And I was really grateful that we were getting quick emergency, but I felt bad at the same time because I was taking these emergency services without really having the emergency. So that was the challenge. Another challenge was, even if I got hold of the phone and called back the alarm company, they could call off the police, they could call off the ambulance, but I found out they could never call off the fire department. So once the fire department is dispatched, they go where they were dispatched to, no matter what you tell them afterwards. Even when they came to my house and I told them we're okay, they would come into the house and walk around to make sure nothing is going on. And I am happy about that. It's not like I'm complaining about somebody making sure we're safe, but I was feeling bad that I was taking this emergency services away from somebody that really needed it for real emergency. So that was challenge number 1. Challenge number 2, I realized when I bought the alarm system and the monitoring, there was this form in there. I was supposed to fill that form out and send it to our local city police with $24 registration fee. And that form asked you your name, contact information, and what you had in the house. Do you have firearms? Do you have pets, dogs, cats? So, it makes sense. So the emergency personnel walking into your house in the middle of alarm emergency call wanted to know what you had in the house. But I didn't realize I was supposed to fill that out and send it to the police department. So I just let it sit there. So after that first 1 or 2 I think 3 at the time. 3 calls we had at the time. I got a letter from the city saying that you didn't register this alarm system that you have. And we came already several times without having this information. You have $100 fine, $100 fine that you have to pay, and the $24, so $124 to register the alarm system and pay the fine. So I did that because I had to, because I was now remembering it after I got this letter from the city. I remember the man who came into my house and had the contract for the alarm system signed, gave me this form. When I went back to the folder he gave me and flipped through, there was exactly the same form that the city had sent to me, that this man had given it to me. So maybe I didn't remember it, I didn't realize it, whatever, but that's not an excuse that's going to get me out of paying $100. So off I went, paid the $124 and registered. And then I realized after several times, I received another letter from the city with a fine saying that you have been getting too many false alarm system calls. So you only have X number of times. I can't remember exactly how many times they said at the time. And I don't remember the amount of the fine because my mother is bedridden now and I don't really get any false alarm anymore. But at the time, my biggest challenge was my mother opening the patio door. I measured the opening space where the sliding door slides back and forth. And I went to Home Depot, bought a piece of 2x4, cut that measurement and put it in. So I put that in there. But then soon enough, she was able to open it. So if you open that sliding door the slightest, less than an inch, it would set up. It has to stay locked and stay pressed together. So, but putting a 2x4 that I could put in at night and take it off during the day would not do that. I kept on measuring. At the end, I cut enough 2x4 where essentially I had to cut that patio door off at night. So we couldn't go through that. So if we needed, even in the summer, to sit on the back deck, we had to go through the main door, walk around the house, and get to the deck that way. So that's how I dealt with making sure my mother stayed in the house. At night, she didn't just take off and leave. And B, that I wasn't getting alarm tripped every hour on the hour of the entire night. So my mother would wake up, use the bathroom, and somehow or another would just open that door. Maybe she wants to take a walk like she used to. I don't know what her issue was. As a part of my reactionary behavior to Alzheimer's, there was no proactiveness in this situation. I had to react. And I was always, as soon as I dealt with one situation, I began to get myself ready for the other shoe to drop and braced myself for the challenge to come. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. Following is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. The sun rose hot and cemented Timira's family's horrible reality. Her baby brother ripped out of her father's arms as they slept. The tragedy brought the entire camp to a grinding halt. The fathers didn't pick up their sacks to look for work. No one went to the water well to fetch water. When the elder son returned with 2 officers following him, Timiro's father jumped up and ran toward them. "They took my child. There were 2 of them," he shouted. He didn't look up to see the doubt on the officers' contorted faces. As if they were trained to do that, both men pulled apart precisely the same way, one foot sitting partially behind the other, the thumb of their right hand resting above their gun holster. They glared at her father. The expectant stance spoke louder than words. "It's all my fault," Timiro's father hit his chest with a closed fist. "How so?" the shorter officer asked. "Tell us about that. I should have woken up at the first call of the prayer." The officers glared at him with a level of condescension that was obvious even to Timiro. They didn't seem to believe him. The shorter officer stepped closer to her father. "Abdisamed, that's your name, isn't it? There is no shame in animal taking the child from your arms." He spoke in the gentle way you would talk to a sad child. "If you were sleeping." Is that what the officers thought? That her father was embarrassed to admit one animal had taken his child? He created fictitious 2 people to protect his pride? They didn't know him as well as she did. This was a man that would die then lie, a man that would never allow his child to be taken like that if he could help it, a man broken by the combination of loss and guilt. "Tell us what happened again?" A tiny smile formed upon the tall officer's lips and exposed his cigarette-stained front teeth. "Start from the beginning this time." Timiro's father stared at the men as if he didn't hear him. "If you don't mind," he added. Her father repeated the story, not from the beginning but the end, where he stood now, staring at his hands. His face bore the utter confusion of things he couldn't explain. "No animal," he stammered, his words disjointed, broken at the seams. "2 people took my child and I couldn't stop them." He bit his bottom lip hard, and blood bubbled around where his front teeth pressed against the flesh. "I slept like a donkey." "Why did you keep the child outside when the rest of the family were inside?" the shorter officer asked. "Stop torturing him with questions." Timiro's mother screamed loud. Hush fell on the entire camp. Her shout echoed. Timiro had never heard her mother speak like that before, shrill and loud. That scared her even more. She ran to her mother and took her hand to feel safe. Farah did the same and took their mother's other hand. Timiro held on so hard, as if she needed it for strength, like an anchor. "We need to know the story." "You already do. He told you more than once. There's nothing more to know. No story, no lie," Timiro's mother responded. "We lost the child and my husband told you what happened." She continued to speak loud. "Help us find our child or leave us be." The 2 officers looked at each other. Perhaps they didn't expect a woman, a village woman, to speak to them like that. "We need your help to help you." The shorter officer turned to the elder. "Please come with us to the station." Timiro's mother dropped her hands and pulled Farah, her father, and Timiro to her in a tight family hug. They stayed like that for the next minute or so, time frozen, their past lives arrested in the lull between the rooster's call and her father's scream. Timiro's mother took her father by the hand when he returned and took him inside their tin room. She guided him toward the stool in the corner, pointed, and he sat down. She pulled another chair closer to him, and a plume of dust rose out of the dirt where the legs of the stool scraped. She didn't ask him about the interview or what the police were doing to find their child, as Timiro had expected. She had unbuttoned her father's shirt and ran her forefinger over the middle scratch on his chest. These are not that deep. She placed her thumb between the two lines, but let me clean it up. She walked over to the clothesline she'd erected inside the room and reached for a clean rag and a shirt. She returned to where he sat and pressed the rag over one of the cuts. The fabric came up covered with blood when she lifted it, exposing his pink flesh. She left the room again, and she returned with a boiling water in a kettle. Dipping the rag in the water, she repeated the same process until she cleaned the wound. Wear this. She handed him a shirt. Timira's father took off the torn shirt and stared down the lacerations. He gave a loud exhale, the creases on his forehead growing deeper as if he'd noticed injury for the first time now. It's the woman that did this. He jabbed a long finger on the cut, and when she did it, this was the first time her father had said anything about a woman. A woman's fingernails left those behind, she thought to herself. But why did her father not give that specific answer when her mother had raised the question, when the officers had asked him? All along, he'd insisted two people had snatched the baby out of his arms, but he'd never mentioned their gender before now. Maybe the image of the scratch triggered his memory. I just woke up then. Her father stopped. I could only see the outline of their frames, but they stood upright on two legs, their four hands upon Isaaq and me. The pain of the recollection was evident on his face. They were quick. Once they latched onto the boy, I had no chance. He looked at Timira's mother for close to a minute, as if he were waiting for her to say, I believe you. You're telling the truth. They were a mere silhouette, but I'd seen them, a man and a woman. Timira knew her father was telling the truth, for she saw no reason for him to lie. He loved her mother, her brothers, and herself beyond measure. He'd die before he'd let anything happen to any of them. Still, piece of his story didn't fit. The way he presented parts of the story made no sense to her. It was one thing for a wild animal to get to the baby, but why would two people snatch a child from his father's arms? Even though the way they spoke to him, enunciating every syllable, infuriated Timira, she couldn't blame the officers for doubting her father's version of what had happened. Was it possible they were two women or two men? Timira's mother asked in the same tone the officers had used. You think I'm lying? Her father sounded hurt, offended that his wife questioning him like the officers, like the police. Of course not, she said. The cuts are not deep enough to have been caused by animals. She put her hand to his knees. These officers do not know you as well as I do. Timira's mother moved a little closer to her father, her gaze fixed on his face, both of her hands now sitting on his knees. If it was too dark and you weren't fully awake, then it would be hard for you to tell how many, right? It doesn't matter the number. I am the one responsible for the loss of my child. Her father stood up quickly as if he'd remembered there was something more critical than recounting the details of what happened. Her mother's hands dropped. Snina, we must find him. We must find Isaaq. Timira's mother turned to him, tears filling her eyes. Where would we look in this dreadful place? From the day they arrived, they all hated the city. From the oldest to the youngest of the children, they lived for the day they would return home. They prayed for it. But Timira's mother despised it the most, more vocal than others in her loathing of this place. She moved between disdain for the place and despair for how long she'd have to stay in it. If Timira's father had agreed, her mother would have returned before the end of that first day. Timira had heard her mother say to her father so many times she'd rather die in thirst in the village than live in this city. It's only evil in here, she'd said to him that first night. I can feel it in my bones. Timira's father took 2 steps toward the door, stopped, turned around to face her mother. I'll find him. I will, he said. Her father and the other men in the camp, their shawls covering their heads, left the camp in a single file soon after. Her father in the lead, the elder recited, there is no power but that of Allah. Others repeated after him. Where do they look for him? Timira asked her mother the second day after the men left. I don't know. She smoothed her braids. I doubt they even know where to go. Where do they go then? They have to keep moving, honey, her mother said. Stopping means accepting we'd lost him for certain. I know I'm not ready for that. Her mother must have known how her father and those who accompanied him felt, for she'd felt the same. From the minute they left and until they came back only a few minutes before sunset, she continued to move. Even when she'd finished collecting water from the well, sweeping the floor of the tiny room, or going to the market and cooking, she created more work. She washed, dried, and braided Timira's hair on the first day, only to repeat the process the following day. Usually she did that once a week. She went to the water well 4 instead of 3 times a day. She washed and re-washed clothes nobody wore. And when she was home, Timira moved in her shadow. 4 days after the loss, 2 police officers arrived at the camp. It was a little over an hour since the rooster's last crow, and the heat was unbearable. One of the officers was there the morning Isaaq was taken. The other one, much taller and heavier than the other officers, was new. He lifted each foot with deliberation, leaning from side to side as if his weight were too much for his legs to carry. The 2 men wore navy blue uniform, clean and recently pressed. They appeared to have dressed to conduct an official business. They approached Timira's parents without greeting other adults they passed. Unlike the first time they visited, these 2 were polite. They spoke to her parents with respect, looking at her father directly in the eyes. Did your child have any identifying marks on his body? The fat officer asked. His short companion stood next to him, staring at his shoes. Why were they asking that? Did Isaaq get mixed up with other children and they didn't know which child to give back to the family? How do you mean? Timira's father seemed absent, dazed. Something that will identify him as your child. That same officer tried to clarify, adding no additional information. He had a dark birthmark on the inside of his left wrist. Timira's mother rubbed her wrist, shaped like a liver. What was he wearing when he went to bed? The heavy officer asked again. Anything you remember? Her mother remembered the khaki pants he wore to bed. I put him in a long-sleeved shirt to repel the mosquitoes, she said. He wouldn't stop fussing, so I took off his shirt. Timira's father ran his hand through his hair. It's here. He pulled the shirt out of his side pocket. I kept it with me. Timira's mother reached for the shirt, but she didn't take it. She caressed it as if her Isaaq would appear with the touch. Anything else? The other officer, who'd been quiet up to this point, asked. Anything else? He repeated. That's when Timira's mother remembered the beaded bracelet they wore. She had beaded them on the last month of all her pregnancies, with glass beads and wooden beads for all her children. Each of them wore until their 6th birthday to ward off the evil eye. The officers turned their attention to Timira's father. You need to come with us to the station, please. Standing between her mother and her brother Farah, Timira watched her father until he disappeared into the laneway. walking between the two officers, the elder right behind him. My Mother, The Person and the Patient can be found in all your favorite podcast apps. Please do not forget to like, listen, follow, share, and leave me a review. And join me next week for another episode where I share with you my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.